Hello and welcome to Analog Insights. In today's episode, I review the TTArtisan 35mm f1.4 lens for the Leica M mount, shooting it on a Leica M6 exclusively with film. This lens is designed as an inexpensive but high-quality alternative to Leica's 35mm Summilux. It really looks and feels basically exactly like the Leica Summilux FLE that was introduced in 2010, despite the fact that it only costs 550 euros in comparison to the almost 5,000 euros that you will be charged when purchasing the 35mm Summilux FLE new. And here is already the point that many Leica purists will point out: why do you go into the Leica M mount system and then decide not to shoot a Leica M lens? And there are all sorts of reasons for doing that, as you will know. Most importantly, of course, the price. There might be situations where you are not willing to spend the amount necessary to get a new Leica M lens. So, for instance, you might be just starting out shooting either film or digital on a Leica M, and just the price of getting into that system might be pretty high. So you might wonder, okay, what is a good lens for starters? And here certain companies like Voigtländer and TTArtisan and also Carl Zeiss might come into play, and you might consider purchasing one of their lenses as an alternative. It's also possible, like in my case, that you have a certain focal length that you really prefer as a primary focal length, like 50mm in my case, and then you still want to complement your lens set and have maybe a 90mm or 35mm or even wider. And then it also comes in handy to have alternatives that are not necessarily from Leica. If you consider shooting these lenses only occasionally, you might not want to break the bank. And then, of course, there are also cases where you don't want to go into the vintage market, for instance, because of certain requirements, like you want to have a state-of-the-art modern coating, for instance, or you don't want to have a particular look but have a really modern, clean, highly corrected look when it comes to aberrations and so forth. So vintage lenses are a great choice, especially for Leica. But if you are looking for something else, then a more modern alternative might also be a good reason. And so for all these reasons, it is more than valid to look at alternatives. And here, I think for this particular case, it's much more realistic to think that the TTArtisan 35mm lens is not really competing with Leica's state-of-the-art 35mm Summilux lens, but it's more realistic to look at the Voigtländer Nokton 35mm f1.4, which is a much smaller lens and costs around 650 euros. Or also maybe the Carl Zeiss Distagon f1.4 lens, which costs around 1,600 euros. So these, I think, are more viable alternatives, so to speak, depending on how you look at the market and what your needs are at any given time. Whatever the purpose is for going into the market, the big question remains when looking at the TTArtisan: can this made-in-China alternative live up to the kind of high-quality look and feel and handling that you would expect on a Leica M mount lens, even at that price point of 550 euros? And what kind of quality do you get without, and what kind of optical performance compromises do you need to make? So this is kind of the big question for this review. And as a 35mm lens, it's of course well suited for street photography, landscape, and is kind of an always-on lens if you're not really like me and prefer 50mm, but are more of a 35mm focal length shooter. Then such a lens is of course really interesting to you. And in order to test it properly, I took it out on a couple of photo walks in Munich and Salzburg. On a recent trip, I went there and shot some Ilford FP4, Ilford Delta 400, and also some color Kodak Portra 400 as well. Full disclosure, TTArtisan sent me this lens for this review. As always, I will share my honest opinion and honest feedback on this lens. I do not get paid by TTArtisan to do this review, and as always, you will get my honest opinion, as always, here on the channel. So let's dive in there. The TTArtisan 35mm f1.4 is an all-metal construction and weighs around 400 grams. It comes in either black or silver, and the black anodized aluminum finish, which we have here, is really beautiful in my opinion. All the markings and engravings are machined to highest standards, and at least cosmetically it really looks and feels just like the original Leica Summilux in my opinion. What is really striking if we compare it to that lens is that even the focusing tab and the felt-lined lens cap are made of metal, so there's no plastic involved in the construction of this lens here, and you really feel that in the heft and the overall quality of it. And it's also remarkable because the much more expensive Leica Summilux actually has some plastic features on it, and even if it's just the focusing tab, you can feel the difference here. Speaking of the focusing tab, the lens focuses between infinity all the way down to 0.7 meters, which is the typical close focus distance for Leica M mount lenses. And the focusing itself feels buttery smooth and really nice. There's just the right amount of resistance in my opinion, and there's zero play, so you don't feel like there were made any compromises in the production of this lens. So a really nice high quality feel to it. The aperture ring is really interesting. You have 10 aperture blades and they click down nicely in half steps between f1.4 and all the way down to f16. And personally, I needed some getting used to the fact that there are only 2 sections with grip on that aperture ring. But once you get your hang around it, you really know where they are. But in comparison to other lenses where you have a full grip around the entire ring, so to speak, the entire aperture ring, it feels a little bit different at first, but once you know it, it is really nice and easy. The rectangular lens shade has a small vent on the upper left corner to improve visibility when you do your composition through the viewfinder. This is of course really nice and common, and personally I also like the rectangular lens shade a lot, so that was a huge plus cosmetically for me. Technically this kind of lens shade does little to actually prevent stray light from coming into the front lens because it's simply not large enough or not overhanging enough. When you look at the profile of this lens, you can see that. So there's still a lot of stray light coming into that lens despite the lens shade. So what about the optical performance of this lens? The lens design consists of 8 elements in 7 groups, with 1 aspherical element and 3 high refractive index elements. There are no floating elements, and the lenses are multi-coated, of course. The overall optical performance is surprisingly good, especially given that price point. The sharpness and resolution are really high and good. And as always, especially once you stop down to f2.8, but even better, the sweet spot I would say is around f5.6 and f8, then sharpness and resolution significantly improve and increase, and you get quite some detail out on a 35mm negative. I was really surprised to see that here. What is really important to many people is of course the bokeh, and in my opinion this bokeh is beautiful and buttery smooth, and especially on shots like this one here where you do have some nice foreground that you want to focus on and still have elements in your background that are an important part of your composition, and you want to have a buttery smooth transition to that background, you can easily do that with that lens. Literally the background melts away and you get drawn into the image really nicely, in my opinion. So creatively, this lens and the bokeh support that a lot. The TTArtisan lens has some slight barrel distortion, which I found a little bit annoying, especially with more architectural and clinical shots and compositions. You can see that here and there during the museum shots in Salzburg, for instance, and really straight compositions. Of course, you can correct that when shooting digital, for instance, or you're fond of post-processing. But personally, I'm not so fond of doing that, and found it a little bit annoying occasionally. But as mentioned, you only really notice it on the clinical shots, and the architectural compositions in other cases, in typical street photography and reportage style shooting, you wouldn't notice it, and it's not bothering you. There is some slight fall off towards the corners, especially when shot wide open. Once you stop down to f2.8 and beyond, this naturally goes away. And when compared to high-end Carl Zeiss and Leica lenses, what is most striking is that the coating does not quite live up to it. And you can particularly see that when looking at the flare resistance or lack thereof. So it is a little bit more prone to flare because of the coating of the lenses. And in a typical shooting situation, you wouldn't notice that it does not quite live up to a Carl Zeiss or Leica coating. You do notice this if you really force it, and as I did here for our test and for the review, shot repeatedly against the light and noticed quite some ghosting and flaring and these kinds of effects. From a creative perspective on the positive side, or depending on who you are and what you think, not so positive side, you can create sun stars with this lens. So the 10 aperture blades create beautiful sun stars around the brilliant sections or brilliant highlights of your frame. And of course you can use that creatively, and some people love these sun stars, others just hate them. Personally, I really enjoy them and found that they enrich my photographs where I used it creatively. The lens renders color really nicely, in my opinion, yet you might encounter some lateral color fringes and even some spherochromatism, which results in different aberrations in different dimensions. So in other words, it might happen to you that you have kind of purple tinges and fringes around certain sections of your highlights or of your frame, and kind of greenish tints on a different layer in your frame in kind of foreground, background dimensions. And then seeing that across the frame, it can be a bit weird, of course. These can be corrected, as always, in Lightroom with a couple of clicks. If you are a digital shooter and fond of post-processing. If you're not, then yeah, you should be aware of that. And of course, that also happens depending on the motif. For digital shooters, it is also important to know that this lens is not 6-bit coded, and apparently it is advisable to use the same profile as the Leica Summilux 35mm f1.4 spherical for this lens here, and you do then get pretty good corrections that kind of match what the lens here needs. So what are my personal impressions? Overall, I really enjoy shooting this lens. The only thing is that it's certainly on the heavier and larger side. So especially in comparison to the Voigtländer Nokton 35mm, that is a significantly smaller and lighter lens, despite the fact that it also is an f1.4 lens. So if a small compact form factor and the lightweight are important to you, then the TTArtisan is probably not the right choice for you. And yet the great build quality, the design and the overall handling are worth noting, and especially the focusing feels fantastic in my opinion. The only thing that I don't like visually is the large TTArtisan logo on the front cap of the lens. Personally, I would prefer something sleeker and yeah, less obtrusive, so to speak. And it also is a strong reminder that you're not carrying an official Leica lens, and I found it a little bit unnecessary, to be honest. Also worth mentioning is always the filter size. In this case, it's an unusually large 49mm filter size, which for me is a little bit annoying because I would need an additional set of filters, especially as a film shooter, for this lens, because it is not compatible with the significantly smaller filter size, the 39mm filter size that I have on my 50mm Summilux, for instance. So if this is important to you, you can also, of course, look at the filter size of your lenses in your setup and then try to align them. Greg did a great job with that, and here the recommendation would be, if you already have, like me, a 50mm Summilux, then go for the 35mm Summilux with a 39mm filter size as well, and you're good to go. So this might be something that you want to factor in as well. One detail that I liked is that the red mounting index ball is easy to see in almost all light situations and can even be prominently felt when you are almost in complete darkness. So if you are shooting at a concert, for instance, and you need to quickly switch lenses without really looking at it, you can, with your index fingers, relatively quickly feel that mark and then yeah, attach a new lens, and it should work perfectly fine. So personally, I'm very happy with the results this lens produces, especially with the bokeh and the overall sharpness. And in my opinion, it is a great deal for the kind of money that you're paying, and I'm really happy to see that there are new players increasingly on that market as well, and especially new players that are producing to high quality standards. The only small downside that I mentioned is optically that propensity to flare, and that a better coating of the lens would be appreciated. But other than that, it is really a solid performer, especially given the money. So if you're in the market for a 35mm Leica M mount lens, I can highly recommend taking a look at this TTArtisan lens here. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Analog Insights and my review of the TTArtisan 35mm f1.4 lens. In my opinion, a great alternative, a great bargain, especially if you're looking for something less expensive. 35mm might not be your preferred focal length and you still want to have it in your lineup, or you're just looking for a modern lens and not a vintage one. I was really surprised by the performance and really enjoy shooting it and get great results with it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember to like it and maybe even share it with your friends. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to our channel. Jules, Greg, and I really appreciate each and every subscriber coming our way. So thanks for watching. I hope to see you soon. Bye.